Welcome to a deep dive into ancient rhetoric.
Huh.
You've given us a ton of material to work with here. Articles, historical accounts, even some literary criticism. It looks like you're fascinated not just by the theory, but by how rhetoric was used in ancient Greece and Rome.
Absolutely. And I think that's where this deep dive gets really interesting. We're going to look at how figures like Cicero use rhetoric to advance their careers and win trials.
Yeah, and even save republics, right? Okay, well, let's start at the beginning. With those ancient Greek roots. I mean, when we think of ancient Greece, we picture, debates and assemblies. Clearly, speaking well was important, but it's interesting that rhetoric initially had kind of a negative connotation. Like it was trickery.
Yeah.
Almost like verbal sleight of hand.
It is interesting, isn't it? You have these figures like Corax and Thrasymachus, who, as you pointed out, were really some of the first to try to systematize persuasion techniques.
Right.
But they also sparked this debate about what rhetoric is really about. Is it about finding truth, or is it just about winning?
Right. Regardless of the facts.
Exactly.
And that tension between the power of words and their potential for manipulation, that seems to be a recurring theme throughout the entire history of rhetoric.
Yeah.
And, speaking of tension, our deep dive takes us next to Plato. And we see from your sources that he wasn't exactly a fan of rhetoric.
No, he wasn't.
Right.
Plato was much more interested in the pursuit of absolute truth.
Through dialogue and reason?
Yeah. He saw rhetoric as a very dangerous tool because it could sway people based on their emotions instead of leading them to true knowledge.
Right.
And he actually, in his dialogue, Gorgias, compares those skilled in rhetoric to pastry chefs, creating something that's appealing but ultimately empty.
Wow, that's a pretty harsh comparison.
It is, but it's very thought-provoking, don't you think?
It is. It is. It really makes you think.
Yeah.
And then there's that line from Gorgias that you highlighted in your notes. It says that rhetoric is a way of making you a slave by your own will. What do you think about that?
Well, it's a powerful statement, and I think it gets to the heart of Plato's suspicion about rhetoric. That it can kind of circumvent our rational minds.
Yeah.
He argued that even though we feel like we're making a free choice when we're persuaded by a skilled orator, we're actually being manipulated by our emotions. We become slaves to the speaker's will.
It makes you wonder if even back then they had, those fake news types that were using rhetoric to mislead people.
Right.
So we have Plato giving us this warning label about rhetoric.
Yeah.
But then comes Aristotle, his student.
Right.
And as we can see from your highlights, he takes a very different approach.
He does. Aristotle was much more pragmatic, I think.
Yeah.
He understood that human beings are complex creatures driven by logic and emotion. So instead of just rejecting rhetoric outright,
You wanted to break it down.
yeah, analyze its components, really understand how it works.
Right. And this is where we get to the really interesting part. And this is especially relevant to, your interest in psychology.
Right.
Because this is where Aristotle identifies those three modes of persuasion.
Yeah. Logos,
Appealing to logic,
pathos,
appealing to emotion,
and ethos.
appealing to the speaker's character. He lays it all out like an instruction manual.
Exactly.
It's pretty incredible. And this is a key point. Some, like Plato, saw emotional appeals as inherently manipulative. But Aristotle said, no, they can be used ethically.
Right.
He believed that a really skilled orator could use those emotions like compassion, patriotism, to move people towards a worthy cause.
Exactly. It depends entirely on the intent and the execution.
So we've gone from this idea of rhetoric as trickery to this much more nuanced view that says it could be used for good or bad.
Right.
But I think it's time we got out of the classroom and onto the stage, because our deep dive takes us next to Rome, where rhetoric was not just something you studied.
Right.
It was a very real tool for power. And no one embodies this better than Cicero.
Yeah, you're right. Cicero was a remarkable figure.
He was a brilliant orator, politician, lawyer, and philosopher. And as you've pointed out in your selections, he lived during a period of great upheaval and change. And he used his skill with words to navigate that landscape.
Yeah.
Built a career that wouldn't have been possible without his mastery of persuasion.
Absolutely.
But he wasn't just talk. He really did put it all into practice. I mean, You gave us that account of Cicero defending Cluentius, a man accused of poisoning, and he basically admitted that he had to throw shadows to win the case.
Yeah, he did. Which, of course, raises some interesting questions about ethics.
It really does.
But it also reveals how deeply he understood how people's minds work.
Right.
And that he was willing to maybe bend the rules a bit to achieve his objectives.
And I think that's part of what makes him so fascinating, right? He wasn't just reciting rules from a textbook.
No.
He was actually using rhetoric to win real battles.
In the courtroom, in the Senate.
Yeah. But to really understand Cicero's impact, I think we have to look at his most famous speeches, the ones he gave during the Catilinarian conspiracy.
Yes.
Those were some really high stakes.
They were. So in 63 BCE, Catiline, this disgruntled Roman senator, tries to overthrow the government. And it's Cicero, who's the consul at the time, who has to step up and expose this plot and rally the Senate against this threat.
And these weren't just speeches. These were rallying cries.
Exactly.
And Cicero used every rhetorical trick in the book to sway the Senate and the Roman people. I mean, one of the things I thought was so clever was his use of prosopopoeia in the first Catilinarian. He actually gives a voice to the laws of Rome and has them condemn Catiline directly.
It's brilliant, isn't it? It shows how skillfully he blended logic and emotion and really vivid imagery to create such a powerful argument.
Yeah. He wasn't just stating facts. He was painting a picture, creating an emotional experience.
Right?
So it's like ancient Roman theater, only with the fate of the Republic hanging in the balance.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so we've seen how Cicero used his rhetorical skills to gain power and even save Rome from a coup.
Yeah.
But was there one right way to speak persuasively in ancient Rome?
Well, that's what makes it even more interesting. Even in ancient Rome, there were these competing schools of thought about the best way to communicate, which leads us to the debate between Atticism and Asianism.
Yes, the rhetorical battle royale.
Exactly.
Now, this is where those scholarly articles you gave us are really helpful because they lay out these different approaches. So Atticism and Asianism, what were they all about?
Well, Atticism, which was named after the clear and concise style favored in Athens, really emphasized clarity, conciseness, and restrained emotion.
Okay.
And its proponents, like Julius Caesar, they believed that the power of language lay in its ability to just convey information directly and efficiently. Think less is more.
Got it.
And then you have Asianism, associated with the more ornate and emotionally charged style that was popular in the Roman province of Asia. It favored a much more elaborate, rhythmic, and expressive approach.
Okay, so we're talking soaring metaphors, dramatic pauses.
Exactly. Pulling at the heartstrings.
So, like the go big or go home school of rhetoric. So where does Cicero fit into all this? Was he team Atticism or team Asianism?
Well, that's a question that scholars still debate to this day.
Really?
Yeah, some see him as a staunch Atticist because his prose is very elegant and clear, but others point to his use of emotion and those stylistic flourishes, and they say, no, that's more Asianism.
So maybe he was a bit of a rhetorical chameleon.
Yeah.
Adapting his style to the situation. I mean, it's not like he would have given a fiery, emotional speech if he were arguing a point of law.
Exactly. And that's where Cicero's genius really shines through. He understood that effective rhetoric isn't about sticking to one style.
It's about choosing the right tools for the job.
It is. He could be clear and concise when he needed to be, but he could also be passionate and evocative when the situation demanded it.
Right.
And that's a valuable lesson for all of us, I think.
It's like he's saying, master all the styles, and then you can choose your weapon wisely. And speaking of choices, this seems like a good place to pause our deep dive.
Okay.
But we're not done yet. In our next segment, we'll see how these competing styles actually played out in Roman politics and law. And we'll also look at how later figures, like Quintilian, built on these ideas.
Okay.
They really saw rhetoric as not just a skill set, but a way of life.
They did.
So we'll pick up there next time.
That's good.
So we've got Cicero strategically blending Atticism and Asianism depending on what he's trying to achieve.
Right.
But these stylistic choices, this whole debate over style, this wasn't just an academic exercise.
Oh, absolutely not. This was ancient Rome. You know, your ability to persuade could determine your political success, your legal standing, even your social status.
Right.
So yeah, these choices really mattered. They had real consequences.
Okay, so imagine I'm a Roman citizen in the forum, and there are two orators going at it.
Right.
One's giving me that crisp, logical Atticism. The other one is throwing in all those Asianist flourishes.
Right.
Who's going to win the crowd over?
Well, that's where, the concept of Chiros that we talked about earlier really comes into play again. It's not just what you say, it's how you say it and when.
Right.
So a skilled orator would think about the audience, the occasion, and really the specific goal of the speech, and they'd tailor their approach accordingly.
Okay, so let's say I'm Cicero, and I'm making the case against Catiline.
Huh?
Do I go full Atticism, keep it calm, logical, Or do I, really let loose some Asianist fireworks and get the Senate riled up?
Well, that's a great question. And in that particular case, I think Cicero really brilliantly combines both approaches.
Sure. Yeah.
He needed to present a clear, logical case outlining the evidence against Catiline.
Right.
But he also needed to, stir up these feelings of outrage and fear.
Right.
He had to get the Senate to act, to do something about this threat.
And this is where, he's just incredible. You pointed out in your notes how in that first Catilinarian, he uses this just incredible series of questions.
Yeah.
Almost like he's boxing Catiline in.
Right.
Logically and emotionally.
It's a masterclass in persuasive technique.
Mm-hmm.
He starts by, appealing to reason. Questioning Catiline's actions and motives, but then he just shifts gears.
Right.
And the style becomes much more emotionally charged. He uses this incredibly vivid imagery and these really passionate appeals to patriotism to really paint Catiline as this dangerous figure.
Right.
A threat to the very foundations of Roman society.
Like, hey, this guy isn't just a political rival.
Right.
This guy's a danger to our way of life.
Right, exactly.
So even though we might think of Cicero as an Atticist, he clearly knew when to bring the drama.
Oh, absolutely. He did. And I think this really highlights something important for anyone who's, interested in persuasion. It's not about picking one style and sticking to it.
Right.
It's about really mastering a whole range of techniques and then knowing which ones to use in a given situation.
So it's about being a rhetorical Swiss Army knife.
That's a great way to put it.
You got to be ready for anything. Okay, well, let's move on to another figure that you highlighted, Quintilian. Now, he comes along a bit later in Roman history.
He does. He lived in the 1st century A.D., and he's considered one of the most important figures when it comes to Roman rhetorical education. His main work, the Institutes of Oratory, is basically this comprehensive guide to becoming a master orator. And it's so interesting to see how he builds upon the work of earlier rhetoricians, like Cicero, but he also brings his own unique insights into it.
And from what I gather, Quintilian wasn't just interested in in teaching people how to speak well. He was interested in, shaping their whole character.
Yeah. He took a really holistic approach to rhetoric. Yeah. To him, it wasn't just about a set of techniques. It was a way of life. He felt that the ideal orator wasn't just someone who could, speak well. They had to be virtuous, an ethical person. Yeah. Someone who used their powers of persuasion for the benefit of society.
So it's not just about winning arguments. It's about, making a positive impact on the world.
Exactly.
That's a pretty powerful idea.
And he took it even further. He said, a truly great orator, they need this really well-rounded education.
Right.
Not just in rhetoric, but history, philosophy, literature, even the sciences.
Wow.
He thought a broad knowledge base was essential for developing sound judgment, for ethical reasoning, for persuasive arguments.
So it's like he's saying, look, you can't just be a good talker.
Right.
You got to have something to say. And that's something we can really relate to today.
I think so, yeah.
Our world is full of information overload, social media sound bites.
Right.
And it's easy to get caught up in the style, the quick comeback, the viral tweet.
It is.
But Quintilian's reminding us that real persuasion, the kind that lasts, the kind that makes difference, that takes a substance.
Right.
It takes integrity.
And a real understanding of the issues.
Exactly. So he's calling for a more thoughtful approach to communication.
Yeah.
One that's about more than just manipulation. It's about genuine understanding.
Yeah, and positive change.
And I think that brings us back to the core of what you seem to be really exploring here, which is how can we use these ancient insights to help us make sense of communication today? Because persuasion's everywhere.
It is. It really is.
Not just in speeches. It's in advertising, marketing, social media, even just our everyday conversations.
It is. It is. And I think what's so fascinating is that while the specific techniques might change, the underlying principles, they stay remarkably relevant. Understanding how language works. Right. How it can be used to appeal to our logic and our emotions.
Right.
How to build trust. These are skills that have lasting value no matter the context.
So those ancient orators, they're basically giving us a set of tools.
They are.
Right? And it's up to us to use those tools wisely and ethically.
Absolutely.
But how do we do that? How do we, in today's world, differentiate between responsible uses of rhetoric and manipulation?
That's the question, isn't it? And I think it all starts with awareness, By understanding how rhetoric works, how language can shape our thoughts and emotions, we can become more critical consumers of information. less susceptible to manipulation.
Like we suddenly have this rhetorical decoder ring.
Exactly.
You can see through the smoke and mirrors.
Yeah. And all those hidden appeals, those carefully crafted phrases that are meant to nudge us in a certain direction.
Okay, so awareness is the first step.
It is. But we also need to cultivate those critical thinking skills.
Right.
Because rhetoric, by its very nature, deals with probabilities, not absolutes.
Right.
It's about presenting arguments persuasively, but it's up to us to really evaluate those arguments, to look at the evidence, and ultimately come to our own conclusions.
So it's not about just blindly accepting what we're told.
No.
It's about engaging with it actively, asking questions, looking at things from multiple perspectives.
Exactly, exactly. And, one last thing I think is really crucial to remember. Rhetoric isn't just about winning.
Okay.
It's about understanding and connecting with other human beings.
Right.
At its best, rhetoric is this tool for building bridges, for fostering empathy, for finding common ground.
That's a beautiful thought. Wow. I mean, as we wrap up our deep dive into ancient rhetoric, I'm really struck by how much knowledge we've uncovered here.
Yeah.
From those early Greek theories to, Cicero's courtroom battles, Quintilian's idea of the ethical orator.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing how these ancient ideas are still relevant today.
It is. It's really remarkable how they've stood the test of time. And I think as we move into this final segment, it's important to consider how we can actually apply this ancient wisdom to our own lives. I mean, let's face it, we're constantly bombarded with persuasive messages,
right? Whether
it's, advertising or political campaigns or even just, navigating our daily interactions.
One of the sources you gave me, a study on modern political rhetoric, it actually argues that a lot of the techniques used by politicians and spin doctors today, they can be traced back to those ancient masters of persuasion.
Right.
It's like they're all working from the same playbook.
That's a great point. And I think it highlights how important it is to understand those basic principles of rhetoric, because once you recognize the techniques that are being used, you're less likely to be swayed by them without realizing it.
Well,
it's like you have this X-ray vision.
Okay.
You can see the persuasive machinery at work.
Okay. So let's say I'm, scrolling through my social media feed and I see a post about a political candidate. How can I use what I know about ancient rhetoric to figure out if I'm being manipulated or, genuinely persuaded?
Well, I think first, think about the source. Who's behind the message? What are their motivations? And then pay really close attention to the language that's being used. Are they appealing to your emotions? Are they using, vivid images, loaded words? Are they making promises that sound a little too good to be true?
It's like those ancient orators are whispering in our ears, beware of glittering generalities.
Exactly. And don't forget to examine the logic of the argument. Are they giving you evidence, facts to back up their claims?
Right.
Are they addressing counter-arguments, or are they just relying on fallacies, those logical errors?
Okay.
Or emotional appeals to kind of bypass your critical thinking.
So it's not just about being swept away by a catchy slogan or, a charismatic personality.
Right.
It's about really digging deeper and asking those tough questions.
It is.
Demanding substance over style.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from our exploration of ancient rhetoric.
Okay.
It gives us the power to become more informed, more discerning, and ultimately more resistant to manipulation.
Like Quintilian saying, hey, don't just sit there and be a passive audience.
Right.
Be an active participant in this conversation. But beyond, analyzing other people's rhetoric, I think this deep dive has also made me more aware of how I communicate.
Oh, I think that's so true. It really can.
Yeah.
Understanding these principles can help us be more effective communicators, in all aspects of our lives, whether we're giving a presentation at work or writing an email, or even just having, a meaningful conversation with a friend or a family member.
One of the things that really struck me was Aristotle's emphasis on ethos.
Yeah.
The speaker's character.
Yeah.
He said that the most persuasive speakers are seen as trustworthy, knowledgeable, and well-intentioned.
Absolutely. That's such a crucial point, because ultimately true persuasion isn't about, tricks or manipulation.
Right.
It's about building relationships, establishing credibility, and communicating authentically, with integrity.
It's like Cicero's saying, hey, if you want people to listen to what you have to say,
right,
let them know you're worth listening to. And that's about more than just having the right words.
It is.
It's about, cultivating those qualities of character that make people trust you.
Yeah, and respect what you have to say.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the main takeaway is this. Ancient rhetoric isn't just some old forgotten thing from the past.
Yeah, it's not.
It's a living, breathing art form.
It is.
And it can really empower us to be better communicators.
Yeah.
More critical thinkers.
And more engaged citizens.
And who knows, maybe we can even use this ancient wisdom to help create a world where communication is a force for good. A world where we understand each other better.
It's a worthy goal.
Okay, well, that's it for our deep dive into ancient rhetoric.
Thanks for joining us. I hope you found it insightful.
We'll see you next time.